from both a commercial and critical standpoint, Alfred Hitchcock is a revolutionary filmmaker. However, he was always bitter because even with all the acclaim he received, he never won a Best Director Oscar from the Academy Awards. The most award recognition he ever received was for Rebecca, an adaptation of Daphne du Maurier's Gothic romantic novel, which won a Best Picture trophy. Rebecca also marked Hitchcock's first foray into American filmmaking, as well as the first time he would work with the highly successful producer David O. Selznick. As Selznick produced the film, the award went to him and not to Hitchcock. As Hitchcock puts it, it's not a Hitchcock picture, it's a novelette. Really, the story is old-fashioned. There is a whole school of feminine literature at the period, and though I'm not against it, the fact is the story is lacking in humor. Even with Hitchcock's reservations, there is no denying the picture is monumental, in no small part due to its scope. The film begins with a pan overlooking a ruined mansion, while the second Mrs. De Winter narrates. Then a jump to Monte Carlo as this unnamed woman, played by Joan Fontaine, stares out into the sea, attracting widower Maxim De Winter, who seeks her company as a way to replace the memory of his deceased wife and the film's namesake character, Rebecca. In the effort of courting this new woman, Maxim brings her to Manderley, his gigantic mansion where he plans to marry her. As the second Mrs. De Winter seeks the truth of the mansion's past inhabitant, and his mise-en-scène and camera work collaborate with the script to convey the heroine's own sense of her own insignificance, being that she is continually dwarfed by the huge halls in which she wanders, Manderley becomes a character itself. Exclaiming the virtues of Manderley in the film, Hitchcock notes that, in a sense, the picture is the story of the house. If so, no room holds more sway over the dramatic narrative of the film than Rebecca's. As the second Mrs. De Winter approaches this room, blasts of eerie organs accompany every step she takes. There is so much apprehension in her body language that when she looks at Maxim's picture on Rebecca's dresser, she appears to be paralyzed. As we view this room with the second Mrs. De Winter, in its immaculately preserved and untouched splendor, we realize that this is the epicenter of the nightmare Rebecca has inflicted on Manderley. This overall sense of foreboding is heightened with the delicate play of light and shadow Hitchcock utilizes. Mrs. Danvers appears completely out of thin air, a silhouette on Rebecca's curtains, frightening the second Mrs. De Winter even more. This scene distinguishes itself from other Mrs. Danvers appearances in the film, as Mrs. Danvers was almost never seen walking and was rarely shown in motion. If she entered a room in which the heroine was, what happened is that the girl suddenly heard a sound, and there was the ever-present Mrs. Danvers standing perfectly still by her side. However, in this scene, she's walking around and interacting with her surroundings, no longer idly watching. The dual nature of the two characters is further exemplified by their costumes. Mrs. Danvers in black, representing the secrets Manderley holds, and the second Mrs. De Winter dressed in white, representing the key to stopping the curse Rebecca's death has inflicted on Maxim. Hitchcock films these actions with so much care and thought in the execution as to elevate the filmmaking from being more than just photographing talking heads, as many contemporary directors did and Hitchcock held contempt against. To examine this scene further, I will look at the specific interactions these key characters have in Rebecca's room. The most important component to these interactions is that Danvers is simulating the past rituals she used to have with Rebecca, and does so to an extremely creepy effect. She pretends to brush the second Mrs. De Winter's hair, shows her all of Rebecca's things, and gets so lost in the moment, she eventually begins talking to the second Mrs. De Winter as if she was Rebecca. She corners the second Mrs. De Winter against a large white door, perfectly symbolizing the entrapment the second Mrs. De Winter feels in Manderley. She could leave at any time, but to do so would be to give up on her new life and her dream of finally winning acceptance from Maxim. This spatial structure perfectly encapsulates the physical as well as psychological clash between these two main characters, as Mrs. Danvers is trying to conjure Rebecca back from the dead, while the second Mrs. De Winter essentially inhabits her ghost. Alternative views about the staging of this crucial scene open up a discourse to the way we view Rebecca, and as this is a landmark film in Hitchcock's canon, these views are especially important to consider. Film critic Robin Wood views the simulation of bringing Rebecca back to life as inherently lesbian in its nature. As he states, the other major censorship stipulation, that the film contained no hint of lesbianism, seems to have been ignored. The scene in which Mrs. Danvers shows Rebecca's room to the second Mrs. De Winter is impossible to misread, and censorship turned a blind eye. Was it, however, censorship or the residual puritanism of the filmmakers that determined that Mrs. Danvers be punished for her perversities? In the novel, she neither dies nor goes insane, and her burning of Manderley can be read as just revenge for Maxim's murder of the woman she loved. This reinterpretation of the scene alters how we view the actions taking place in the scene, and alters them from being something dreadful to being, albeit in a strange way, something romantic. Another interpretation Wood has is that he sympathizes with Rebecca, painting her as the heroine of the film, and while I don't agree with this interpretation, it does offer many interesting viewpoints. For one, it changes the dynamic of the bedroom scene from the second Mrs. De Winter being a victim to being a menace. After being exposed to Rebecca's things, and then coerced by Mrs. Danvers to interact with them, she becomes someone negative, someone invading a past soul's personal space and desecrating it solely for Mrs. Danvers' satisfaction. Another critic, Tanya Modleski, used her simulation with Rebecca's possessions as another critical step in the female Oedipal trajectory, in which the second Mrs. De Winter physically embodies Rebecca and therefore is finally able to win the affections of Maxim. In reiterating that Manderley is an important character in the film, it is essential to look into the architecture of the house as well. The physical appearance of Manderley was something very deliberate. It is noted that Hitchcock sent notes, sketches, and photographs to the studio while in the process of choosing a location. To be able to properly film the climactic fire sequence, the house had to be built as a miniature, and at the time of the film's development, is one of the largest miniatures Hollywood had ever produced. The relationship between Mrs. Danvers and the second Mrs. De Winter is ostensibly one of the servant and the master, a Victorian social dynamic that plays out to even greater effect because the house itself is a Victorian country house. The scene where the second Mrs. De Winter is petrified for accidentally wearing Rebecca's dress to the ball is a perfect example of the use of staircases in Hollywood melodramas. As the second Mrs. De Winter ascends the staircase to her room, one could draw an intertextual example to Vertigo, in which the female lead runs up a flight of stairs and viewers are led to believe she either did, or is going to, commit suicide. Although the two scenes play out differently, it opens up a dialogue to the way in which Hitchcock maximizes the effect of the set pieces he uses in his films. The labyrinthine construction of the house also makes it impossible for the second Mrs. De Winter to acclimate herself to her new surroundings, and accentuates the mental anguish she is going through. Victorian houses such as Manderley also tended to have asymmetrical floor plans and the tendency to individualize every room, adding to the cinematic identity of Rebecca's room, as well as contributing to the feeling of mystery inside its many corridors. The burning of Manderley is another important scene to consider spatially. The camera pans through the entire mansion in all of its grandiosity. Then the camera closes up to reveal the final image of Rebecca's embroidered silk pillow burning away in the fire. The embroidery is introduced in the scene where the second Mrs. De Winter is shown Rebecca's room and initially causes her discomfort. However, as the pillow turns to ashes, it symbolizes the burning away of the memory of Rebecca and all of the pain she brought. With this behind them, Maxim and the second Mrs. De Winter can start a new life, although it will be hard to forget these past events. As Modleski puts it, if death by drowning did not extinguish Rebecca's desire, can we be certain that death by fire has reduced it utterly to ashes? The fact that Manderley's specific location is never brought up is a fact not lost on the director. Hitchcock believed that the lack of an actual geographic area for viewers to reference maximized the feeling of isolation on screen. This effect is doubled by the empty hallways, toweringly high ceilings, and mysterious enclaves that populate Manderley. Manderley's setting on a desolate beach exacerbates the fact that, for these characters, Manderley may as well be on the end of the earth. This sea location is also used to display the ambiguity of Rebecca's death and plays a major part in the film's narrative, as Maxim used his boat to dispose of her body. The facade of Manderley residing in its own self-contained universe may be shattered as cops, psychologists, and firefighters enter the fray in the film's climax. However, for most of the film's proceedings, the spatial structure of Manderley radiates nothing but pure loneliness and gothic intensity.